A heartless son kicks his 75-year-old mother out of her mansion on her birthday, telling her to enjoy the streets. But when hidden documents and suspicious meetings lead to a shocking discovery, he realizes his cruel mistake may cost him everything. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment below from where are you watching from today. Margaret Thornton woke up on her 75th birthday feeling hopeful. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the mansion she'd called home for the past 50 years. She got dressed carefully, choosing her favorite blue dress and the pearl necklace her late husband Robert had given her on their 30th wedding anniversary. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and despite her age, her blue eyes still sparkled with life. Today will be special, she told herself, thinking of her son, Jonathan. He was now the CEO of Thornton Industries, the company Robert had built from nothing. At 45, Jonathan had everything: success, wealth, and a beautiful wife, Victoria. Margaret tried not to think about how things had changed since Victoria came into their lives 3 years ago. Making her way down to breakfast, Margaret was surprised to find the dining room empty. No birthday cards, no flowers, not even the usual morning coffee set up. The kitchen staff, who normally greeted her warmly, were nowhere to be seen. Her heart sank a little, but she kept hoping. She heard voices coming from Jonathan's study and walked toward them. The door was slightly open, and she could hear Victoria's voice, sharp and cold. "We need to do it today, Jonathan. Your mother's getting too involved in company matters. Did you see her in your office yesterday looking through those files? She was probably just cleaning, Victoria. You know how she likes to keep busy," Jonathan replied, sounding tired. "Cleaning? Don't be naive. She's suspicious about the new offshore accounts. Daniel said she's been asking questions." Margaret's hand froze inches from the door. Offshore accounts? Daniel Roberts had been Jonathan's best friend since college, and was now the company's COO. What were they talking about? Before she could think more about it, Victoria's voice cut through her thoughts. "It's time, Jonathan. We talked about this. The nursing home is ready for her." Margaret's heart stopped. Nursing home? She must have made some sound because suddenly the door swung open. Victoria stood there, tall and elegant in her designer suit, her face transforming from surprise to a cold smile. "Margaret, we were just talking about you," Victoria said sweetly. "Happy birthday." Jonathan appeared behind his wife, not meeting his mother's eyes. He was holding a folder labeled Golden Years Retirement Community. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. The next hour was a blur. Margaret sat in the study she'd decorated herself, listening as her own son explained why she needed to transition to a more suitable living arrangement. Victoria stood by the window, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against a crystal glass. "You can't take care of this big house anymore," Jonathan was saying. "The staff has complained." "What staff?" Margaret interrupted. "You fired them all last month, remember? Victoria said it was too expensive." "See, this is exactly what I mean," Victoria cut in. "You're always criticizing our decisions. This is our home now, Margaret. You need to understand that." 2 hours later, Margaret stood at the front door with 2 suitcases. The same door she'd walked through as a young bride, where she'd welcomed Jonathan home from college, where she'd greeted countless guests at charity events she'd organized for the company. "The car will take you to Golden Years," Victoria said, handling Margaret a glossy brochure. "Everything's been arranged." Margaret looked at her son, searching for any sign of the boy she'd raised. "Jonathan, please." But he wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's for the best, Mom, you'll see." As the door closed behind her, Margaret heard Victoria's voice. "Finally. Call Daniel. Tell him we can move forward with everything now." Standing there in her birthday dress, holding her suitcases, Margaret made a decision. She wasn't going to any nursing home. She pulled out her phone and called the one person she knew she could trust, her oldest friend, Grace. "Murphy. Grace, it's Margaret. I need your help." The day that was supposed to be a celebration of 75 years of life had become the day Margaret Thornton lost her home. But it was also the day she started to uncover a truth that would shake the Thornton family to its core. Grace Murphy was in her garden when the taxi pulled up to her seaside cottage. The moment she saw Margaret's face, she knew something was terribly wrong. Grace dropped her gardening tools and rushed to hug her friend of 50 years. "Margaret, what on earth happened?" Grace asked, taking in the sight of her friend's suitcases and tear-stained face. "They threw me out, Grace," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "My own son threw me out of my home on my birthday." Grace's face turned red with anger. "He did what?" That boy has lost his mind, and let me guess, that wife of his was behind it all? Inside Grace's cozy living room, over cups of hot tea, Margaret told her everything. Grace's cottage wasn't anything like the Thornton mansion. It was small and simple, with mismatched furniture and family photos everywhere. But to Margaret, it felt more like home than her son's cold mansion had in years. They wanted to send me to a nursing home, Margaret said, clutching her teacup. But I heard them talking about something else, Grace. Something about offshore accounts. Victoria was telling Jonathan I was getting too suspicious. Grace sat up straighter. Offshore accounts? That doesn't sound right. Your Robert built that company on honesty. Remember how proud he was when they won that ethics in business award? I know, Margaret nodded. And Daniel's involved too. I heard them mention his name. Daniel Roberts. Grace snorted. That boy practically lived at your house growing up. Robert treated him like a second son. And now he's helping them? Margaret reached for her purse and pulled out an old leather notebook. I grabbed this from my room before I left. It's Robert's old business ledger. He kept track of everything in here. Grace put on her reading glasses and leaned forward. I think there's something in here that could help. I don't know, Margaret admitted, but Robert always said to keep good records because the truth shows up in the numbers. As they flipped through the old ledger, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara, their former housekeeper who Victoria had fired last month. Mrs. Thornton, I just heard what happened. I need to tell you something important. Can we meet? Grace read the message over Margaret's shoulder. Well, she said. Looks like we might have an ally. Clara was always loyal, Margaret said. She worked for us for 20 years before Victoria let her go. Then we should talk to her, Grace declared. And I'm calling my nephew Tommy, too. He's an accountant. He can help us make sense of these numbers. Margaret looked around. Grace's small living room, so different from the grand spaces she was used to. But sitting there with her oldest friend, planning their next move, she felt stronger than she had in years. I raised that boy better than this, Margaret said quietly. And if Victoria and Daniel are up to something that could hurt him or the company, I need to find out what it is. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand. We'll figure it out together. Nobody messes with my best friend and gets away with it. Later that night, as Margaret lay in Grace's guest room, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Jonathan, as a little boy sitting on Robert's lap in the study, saying he wanted to be just like his dad when he grew up. Where had that boy gone? What had Victoria done to change him so much? Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Clara. Mrs. Thornton, be careful who you trust. I overheard something last week, something bad. We need to meet somewhere private. Margaret showed the message to Grace, who was checking on her before bed. Well, Grace said with a determined smile. Looks like we've got work to do tomorrow. Get some rest, Margaret. Something tells me we're going to need it. As Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, she held on to one thought. She wasn't going to let Victoria destroy everything Robert had built. And maybe, just maybe, she could save her son in the process. The next morning, Margaret and Grace sat in a quiet corner of Joe's diner waiting for Clara. The small restaurant was nearly empty, just a few regulars having their morning coffee. Margaret kept glancing at the door, her hands wrapped around her cup of tea. Clara rushed in at exactly 9 o'clock. She looked different from her days as the Thornton housekeeper. No uniform now, just simple jeans and a sweater. But her face showed the same caring expression Margaret remembered. Mrs. Thornton, Clara said, sliding into the booth. I came as soon as I could. I've been so worried since they fired me. What happened, Clara? Margaret asked. Why did Victoria really let you go? Clara looked around nervously before leaning closer. It wasn't about the budget like she claimed. It was because I overheard her and Mr. Roberts in the study late one night. Grace moved closer too. Daniel Roberts? What were they saying? They were arguing about some company called Blue Ocean Investments, Clara explained. Mrs. Victoria was angry because Mr. Roberts hadn't transferred the money fast enough. She said they needed to hurry before… Clara paused, looking at Margaret with sad eyes. Before they got rid of you, Mrs. Thornton. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Blue Ocean Investments? I've never heard of it. That's because it doesn't really exist, said a new voice. They all looked up to see Tommy Matthews, Grace's nephew, standing at their table. He was in his 30s, wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a laptop bag. Tommy! Grace stood to hug her nephew. Thank you for coming so quickly. Tommy sat down and opened his laptop. I did some digging after you called, Aunt Grace. Blue Ocean Investments is a shell company set up 6 months ago. Guess who signed the incorporation papers? Daniel Roberts. Margaret pulled out Robert's old ledger. "Can you make sense of these accounts, Tommy? Compare them with what's happening now." For the next hour, Tommy examined the ledger while Clara told them everything she'd seen and heard in her last months at the mansion. The picture that emerged made Margaret's heart ache. "They're stealing from the company," Tommy finally said, pointing to his computer screen. "Millions of dollars being moved through this fake company into offshore accounts, but they're doing it in a way that makes it look like normal business expenses." "And Jonathan doesn't know?" Grace asked. Clara shook her head. "Mr. Jonathan signs whatever Mrs. Victoria puts in front of him. She tells him it's all routine paperwork and he trusts her completely." "But why?" Margaret wondered. "Why would Daniel do this? Robert treated him like a son." "Because of the merger," Clara said quietly. "I heard Mrs. Victoria tell him that once the Morrison deal goes through next month, they'll have access to even more money. Then they'll transfer everything and disappear." Mrs. Victoria said Mr. Jonathan would take the fall when people realized what happened. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. The Morrison deal. She'd heard Jonathan talking about it excitedly just last week. It would be the biggest merger in the company's history. "We have to stop them," Margaret said firmly. "But Jonathan won't believe me if I tell him. Victoria's made sure of that." "Then we need proof," Tommy said. "Real proof he can't ignore. I can track the money transfers, but we need something more concrete." "The safe," Clara suddenly remembered. "In the study. Mrs. Victoria keeps all her important papers there. I saw her put something inside the day before she fired me." Grace straightened up. "So we need to get into that safe." "Impossible," Margaret shook her head. "Victoria changed all the security codes after I left." "Not all of them," Clara smiled. "I wrote down the new code for the back entrance. Mrs. Victoria doesn't know I saw her set it up." They all stared at each other as the idea took shape. Breaking into the mansion, it sounded crazy, but what choice did they have? "If we're going to do this," Tommy said, "it has to be this Friday. Victoria and Daniel always have their weekly meeting at the country club. Jonathan will be at the office." "I'll help," Clara said firmly. "I still have my uniforms. The security guards know me. They'll think I'm just there to clean." Margaret looked around at these people willing to risk so much to help her. "I can't ask you all to do this." "You're not asking," Grace said, taking her hand. "We're offering. Besides," she smiled, "I've always wanted to be a spy." As they made their plans, Margaret thought about Jonathan. Soon he would know the truth about his wife. Soon he would understand why his mother had seemed so suspicious of Victoria. But would it be enough to save him from losing everything? "Friday then," Margaret said quietly. "God help us all." Friday morning arrived with dark clouds threatening rain. Margaret sat in Grace's car across the street from the mansion, her heart pounding. She was wearing one of Clara's old housekeeping uniforms, her silver hair hidden under a dark wig. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked from the driver's seat. She'd insisted on being their lookout. "We don't have a choice," Margaret replied, watching Victoria's red sports car pull out of the driveway. Right on schedule, she was heading to her weekly tennis game at the country club. 20 minutes later, Jonathan's black Mercedes followed. He never missed a Friday board meeting. "Remember," Tommy said from the back seat, checking his phone, "you have exactly 45 minutes before Victoria usually returns. Clara's already inside. She'll meet you at the service entrance." Margaret touched the pearl necklace hidden under her uniform. Robert's voice seemed to whisper in her mind, "Do what's right, my love, no matter how hard it seems." The back entrance looked exactly the same. White door, brass handle, small keypad. Clara was waiting, dressed in her old uniform too. Her hands shook slightly as she punched in the code. "Mrs. Thornton," she whispered, "are you ready?" Inside, the mansion felt different, colder somehow. Victoria had changed everything. New furniture, new paintings, even new carpets. But Margaret didn't have time to feel sad about that now. They moved quickly through the service corridors toward the study. Clara had timed the security guards' rounds perfectly. Just like in the old days, they passed through the kitchen at exactly 10:15 for their coffee break. The study door was locked, but Margaret knew where the spare key was hidden, behind a loose panel in the wooden trim, some things even Victoria hadn't discovered. "Hurry," Clara whispered, standing watch at the door. "The safe is behind the new painting, the ugly modern one." Margaret moved the painting aside. The safe was small but sophisticated, a digital keypad with a fingerprint scanner. Her heart sank. "Now what?" Clara pulled out a small cloth and a piece of clear tape. "The cleaning staff sees everything, Mrs. Thornton. Victoria never changes." Her coffee cup between meetings. I got her fingerprint this morning while serving her breakfast. Margaret stared at her former housekeeper with new respect. The fingerprint worked, but they still needed the code. Try 051719, Clara suggested. It's the date she met Mr. Jonathan. She uses it for everything. The safe clicked open. Inside, Margaret found exactly what they needed. Folders full of documents about Blue Ocean investments, offshore account numbers, and emails between Victoria and Daniel discussing their plans. But there was something else too, a manila envelope, marked private. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were photos of Victoria with another man taken just last week. They were clearly more than friends. "Oh, Jonathan," Margaret whispered, "I'm so sorry." Suddenly, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Clara's face went white. Someone's coming, but the guards shouldn't be back yet. Margaret quickly took photos of everything with her phone and put the documents back. But before they could close the safe, they heard Victoria's voice in the hall. "I don't care what Jonathan says, Daniel. After the merger next week, we're moving everything. He'll be too busy dealing with the fallout to notice we're gone." Margaret and Clara looked at each other in panic. They were trapped. Victoria's voice got closer. "I just need to grab something from the safe. Wait here." Clara grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her behind the heavy velvet curtains. Margaret held her breath as Victoria entered the study. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see her daughter-in-law walk to the safe. Victoria stopped suddenly. "That's strange. I could have sworn I left this painting." "Straight!" Margaret's heart nearly stopped as Victoria moved closer to the curtains. Just then, a loud crash came from the hallway. "Oh my goodness!" They heard Grace's voice. "I'm so sorry. I was looking for the ladies' room and knocked over this beautiful vase." Victoria rushed out to investigate. Margaret and Clara didn't waste a second. They slipped out through the study's second door, the one hidden behind a bookshelf that Victoria didn't know about. Minutes later, they were back in Grace's car, their hearts racing as they drove away. "Did you get everything?" Tommy asked, from the back seat. Margaret nodded, her hands still shaking as she showed him her phone. "Everything and more, but we have to act fast. They're planning to do it next week right after the merger." "What about those personal photos you found?" Grace asked gently. Margaret thought about her son, about the pain these revelations would cause him. He needs to know everything, no more secrets. As they drove back to Grace's cottage, storm clouds finally broke and rain poured down. But Margaret barely noticed. All she could think about was Jonathan and how she was about to turn his whole world upside down. "He won't see you," Jonathan's secretary said, but Margaret walked past her anyway. She'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say. Now it was Monday morning and time was running out. Jonathan looked up from his desk, his face hardening when he saw her. "Mom, how did you get in here?" "Your secretary still remembers when I used to bring you lunch every day," Margaret said, closing the door behind her. She noticed how tired Jonathan looked, how the worry lines around his eyes had deepened. "I'm busy," he said, turning back to his computer. "The Morrison merger will destroy everything your father built," Margaret finished. She placed her phone on his desk and played the recording she'd made in the study. Victoria's voice filled the room. "I don't care what Jonathan says, Daniel. After the merger next week, we're moving everything. He'll be too busy dealing with the fallout to notice we're gone." Jonathan's face went pale. "Where did you get this?" "There's more." Margaret pulled out copies of the documents Tommy had analyzed. "Blue Ocean Investments. It's a fake company. Victoria and Daniel have been stealing millions through it." "That's impossible," Jonathan said, but his voice shook. "Victoria wouldn't." Margaret laid out the offshore account records, the transfer documents, everything they'd found. "Tommy Matthews checked it all. He's a forensic accountant. These numbers don't lie, Jonathan." "Tommy Matthews?" Jonathan laughed bitterly. "Grace's nephew. So this is what you've been doing since you left? Conspiring with strangers against my wife? Look at the papers, Jonathan. Really look at them. This is your father's company they're destroying." Jonathan stood up, running, his hands through his hair. "Get out, Mom. Just get out." That's when Margaret pulled out the photos. "There's one more thing you need to see." She watched her son's face as he looked at the pictures of Victoria with her lover, watched as his world crumbled piece by piece. "When?" he started, his voice breaking. "Last week. She meets him at the Golden Orchid Hotel every Tuesday and Thursday." Margaret's heart ached for her son's pain. "I'm so sorry, Jonathan." Jonathan sank into his chair, the photos trembling in his hands. "I trusted her. I chose her over." He looked up at his mother, tears in his eyes. "Oh God, Mom, what I did to you." Margaret moved around the desk and took her son's hand. For a moment he was her little boy again, needing his mother's comfort. "Why didn't I see it?" he whispered. "Because you loved her," Margaret said simply, "and love makes us want to believe the best about people." Jonathan stood suddenly. "The Morrison merger meeting starts in an hour. Victoria and Daniel will be there. They're planning to transfer everything as soon as the deal goes through," Margaret finished. "They've already set it up." Jonathan pressed his intercom. "Janet, call security. I need them in the boardroom in 45 minutes, and get me Walter Chen from legal immediately." He turned to his mother. "I need copies of everything you have. And Mom, I need your help." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "Of course, sweetheart." "No." Jonathan shook his head. "I mean, I really need your help. You always understood this business better than me. Dad trained you alongside him for 30 years. I was too proud to admit I needed your guidance, too eager to prove myself." "It's not too late," Margaret said softly. Jonathan hugged her then, really hugged her, for the first time in years. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." "I know, sweetheart, I know." They spent the next 40 minutes going over their plan. Walter Chen arrived with a team of lawyers. Security was briefed. Everything was set. As they walked toward the boardroom, Jonathan asked, "Will you stay with me? Come back home." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Let's stop Victoria and Daniel first, then we'll talk about home." They could hear voices inside the boardroom. Victoria's laugh carried through the door, that same fake laugh Margaret had heard so many times. Jonathan took a deep breath and straightened his tie. "Ready?" Margaret nodded. "Ready." Together, mother and son opened the boardroom doors, ready to face whatever came next. The Thornton Industries boardroom fell silent as Jonathan and Margaret entered. Victoria's smile froze when she saw her mother-in-law. Daniel Roberts stopped mid-sentence, his coffee cup hovering halfway to his mouth. "Jonathan?" Victoria's voice was sweet as honey. "What's she doing here?" The room was packed for the Morrison merger meeting. Board members, lawyers, even Mr. Morrison himself sat around the massive oak table. Security guards stood quietly by both doors. "Please, everyone, be seated," Jonathan said, his voice stronger than Margaret had heard it in years. "Before we discuss the merger, there are some matters we need to address." Victoria stood up, adjusting her designer jacket. "Darling, these people are very busy. We shouldn't waste their time with family drama." "Oh, this isn't about family," Jonathan replied. He nodded to Walter Chen, who started distributing folders to everyone in the room. "This is about fraud. Securities fraud, to be exact." Daniel's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. "Jonathan, what are you doing?" "My job," Jonathan answered. "The job I should have been doing all along instead of letting others make decisions for me." He looked at the papers in front of him. "Would anyone like to explain what Blue Ocean Investments is?" The color drained from Victoria's face. "That's a routine subsidiary company for tax purposes." "Really?" Margaret spoke up. "That's not what you told Daniel last Friday. What was it you said?" "After the merger, we're moving. Everything. Jonathan will be too busy dealing with the fallout to notice we're gone." Victoria's head snapped toward Daniel. "You said the study was safe. You said no one could access the recordings." "Recordings?" Jonathan raised his eyebrows. "I didn't mention any recordings, Victoria." The room erupted in whispers. Mr. Morrison stood up, his face red with anger. "What is going on here?" Walter Chen cleared his throat. "If you'll look at page 3 of your packets, you'll see detailed evidence of systematic fraud. Mrs. Victoria Thornton and Mr. Daniel Roberts have been embezzling company funds through a shell corporation. They plan to steal millions more once the merger went through." "That's ridiculous," Daniel shouted, standing up. "Jonathan, you can't believe this nonsense. Your mother's just jealous of Victoria. She's trying to cause trouble." "Sit down, Daniel," Jonathan said quietly. "The FBI is already on their way." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine, and I'm your wife." "Ex-wife, actually," Walter Chen interjected. "The divorce papers were filed this morning, along with this." He held up a manila envelope. "Should I share the photos with everyone, Mrs. Thornton? The ones from the Golden Orchid Hotel?" Victoria's face went from white to red. She grabbed her purse and tried to run for the door, but the security guards blocked her path. "How could you?" she screamed at Jonathan. "I made you what you are." "No," Jonathan said firmly. "My parents made me who I am. I just forgot that. For a while." He turned to Daniel. "And you? My father treated you like a son." Daniel seemed to collapse in on himself. "Victoria said we'd split everything. She promised—" "Oh, shut up, you fool!" Victoria spat. Like I'd ever run away with you. Margaret watched it all unfold. Victoria's mask finally crumbling. Daniel's weakness exposed. The board members' shock turning to anger as they realized how they'd almost been deceived. But mostly she watched her son, standing tall and strong, finally becoming the man his father had always believed he could be. The FBI arrived 15 minutes later. As they led Victoria and Daniel away in handcuffs, Margaret heard Victoria's last bitter words, "I should have sent you to that nursing home the day I married him." Jonathan put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "I'm sorry everyone had to witness this," he told the board. "But Thornton Industries was built on honesty and transparency. It's time we return to those principles." Mr. Morrison stepped forward. "I think we need to postpone merger discussions until this situation is resolved." "I understand," Jonathan nodded, "and I want to personally assure you that every penny they stole will be accounted for and returned." After everyone left, Jonathan and Margaret stood alone in the boardroom. Outside, reporters were already gathering, alerted by someone about the arrests. "It's going to be a circus," Jonathan sighed. "The press will have a field day with this." "You did the right thing," Margaret said. "Your father would be proud." Jonathan turned to his mother, his eyes full of tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "You're my son," Margaret said simply. "You'll always deserve my forgiveness. Come home, Mom, please. That house, it's not a home without you." Margaret touched her pearl necklace, Robert's gift from so long ago. "Yes," she said softly. "It's time to come home." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The mansion buzzed with energy as Margaret oversaw the removal of Victoria's cold modern furniture, replacing it with the warm antiques that had been stored in the basement. Clara was back as head housekeeper, supervising a new staff that actually smiled and laughed in the halls. "It feels like the old days," Clara said one morning as she brought Margaret her coffee in the garden. The roses Margaret had planted decades ago were blooming again, no longer choked by Victoria's artificial topiaries. "Better than the old days," Margaret replied. "Now we know who our true friends are." Those friends had gathered for Sunday dinner, a tradition Margaret was determined to restore. Grace sat at the table beside Tommy, who was now Thornton Industries' new chief financial officer. Jonathan had insisted on hiring him after seeing how quickly he'd uncovered Victoria's scheme. "To think," Grace laughed, passing the mashed potatoes, "if Victoria hadn't kicked you out, we might never have caught them." "Speaking of catching them," Jonathan said, entering the dining room with an evening newspaper, "Victoria and Daniel both pleaded guilty today. They're facing serious prison time." Margaret saw the pain flash across her son's face. The divorce had been finalized last week, and even though Victoria had betrayed him terribly, Margaret knew Jonathan was still healing from the loss of what he'd thought was love. "Time heals all wounds, sweetheart," she said softly. "That's what Dad always said." Jonathan smiled. Then he cleared his throat. "Which reminds me, I have something to show you all after dinner." Later, they gathered in Robert's old study. Jonathan had restored it exactly as it had been, down to the leather chair where he used to sit on his father's lap. "The Morrison merger is back on," Jonathan announced. "But this time we're doing it Dad's way, ethical, transparent, no shortcuts." "Robert would be so proud," Grace said, squeezing Margaret's hand. "There's more," Jonathan continued. He turned to Tommy. "The board voted today. They want to create a new oversight committee to prevent anything like Victoria's scheme from ever happening again. Mom, they want you to chair it." Margaret's hand flew to her pearl necklace. "Me? You know this company better than anyone," Jonathan said. "You helped Dad build it from nothing. It's time everyone recognized that." Clara wiped tears from her eyes. Even Tommy looked emotional. "Also, Jonathan, we're starting a charitable foundation in Dad's name. Grace, would you consider running it? We need someone with a good heart and strong values." Grace's eyes widened. I'd be honored." Margaret looked around the room at these people who had stood by her when everything seemed lost. Clara, who had risked her job to help uncover the truth. Tommy, who had used his skills to protect the company rather than exploit it. Grace, her dearest friend, who had opened her home and heart without hesitation. And Jonathan. Her son had faced his mistakes and emerged stronger, wiser, more like his father than ever before. "Mom?" Jonathan's voice brought her back to the present. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret smiled. "I was thinking about something your father used to say. Life isn't about the mistakes we make, it's about how we fix them." Jonathan hugged her tight. "He also used to say you were always right." "Well," Margaret laughed, "about that he definitely was right." As the evening wound down, Margaret stood in the garden looking up at the stars. The same stars she and Robert had gazed at as newlyweds, the ones they'd shown Jonathan during summer camping trips in the backyard. Grace joined her outside. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I was just thinking about how things work out," Margaret replied. "Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best ones." "Speaking of best moments," Grace grinned, "wait until you meet my nephew's new secretary. She's lovely, about Jonathan's age and completely different from Victoria." Margaret laughed. "Grace Murphy, are you playing matchmaker?" "Just saying, a mother's work is never done." Inside, they could hear Jonathan and Tommy discussing business plans, while Clara directed the new staff in cleaning up. The mansion felt alive again, filled with warmth and laughter and love. "You know what?" Margaret said, linking arms with her best friend. "You're right. A mother's work is never done, and I wouldn't have it any other way." 3 months had passed since Victoria's arrest, and autumn was painting the trees around the mansion in brilliant colors. Margaret sat in her new office at Thornton Industries, reviewing reports for the Oversight Committee. She smiled at how different things were now. The door opened, and Sarah Chen, Tommy's new secretary, poked her head in. She was pretty in a natural way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, everything Victoria hadn't been. "Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Jonathan asked me to bring you these contracts personally." Sarah's cheeks turned slightly pink. "He said you'd want to review them before the Morrison meeting." Margaret noticed how Sarah's eyes lingered on the family photos on her desk, especially the one of Jonathan from last week's charity gala. "Thank you, dear. How are you settling in?" "Everyone's been so kind," Sarah said, "especially Mr. Jonathan. He takes time to explain things, not like my old boss who just barked orders." The phone rang. It was Grace. "Turn on the news," her friend exclaimed. "They're announcing Victoria's sentence." Margaret switched on the office TV. Victoria's face filled the screen as she was led from the courthouse. She'd lost her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair, but her expression was still cold and hard. Victoria Thornton and Daniel Roberts were sentenced to 15 years each, the reporter announced. In related news, Thornton Industries. "Stock has reached new highs under the reformed leadership," Sarah gasped. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton, I shouldn't be watching this." "It's all right," Margaret said kindly. "We all need closure." Jonathan burst into the office, his tie slightly crooked. "Mom, did you see?" "I saw," Margaret nodded. "Are you okay?" "Actually, yes." Jonathan smiled, then noticed Sarah. "Oh, I didn't realize, how are you, Sarah?" Margaret hid her smile as she watched them both blush and stumble over their words. Young love was always awkward at first. "I should go," Sarah said quickly. "I have those reports to file." "Wait," Jonathan called. Would you like to get coffee sometime?" "To discuss the reports, of course." Sarah's whole face lit up. "I'd like that." After she left, Jonathan turned to find his mother grinning. "Mom, don't start." "I didn't say a word." Margaret held up her hands innocently. "But she is lovely and smart. Grace says she puts in extra hours studying the company's history." "Mom!" All right." Margaret stood and straightened her son's tie. "The Morrison meeting starts in 10 minutes. Are you ready?" Jonathan's face turned serious. "Thanks to you, I am. The Oversight Committee's new procedures are exactly what Mr. Morrison wanted to see. The merger's going to happen. The right way this time." They walked together to the boardroom. The same room where Victoria's schemes had fallen apart now held new promise. Tommy was already there setting up his presentation. Clara had arranged coffee and pastries. "For good luck," she'd said. As board members filed in, Margaret noticed how different the atmosphere was. People were smiling, chatting, no longer afraid of hidden agendas or secret plots. Mr. Morrison arrived last, shaking hands warmly. "Margaret, the oversight proposals are brilliant. Reminds me of how Robert used to run things." "Thank you," Margaret replied. "We're getting back to our roots." The meeting went perfectly. The merger was approved unanimously. As people celebrated, afterward, Margaret saw Jonathan and Sarah stealing glances at each other across the room. Grace appeared at her elbow. Well, looks like someone's getting more than a merger today." "Grace Murphy, you matchmaker," Margaret laughed. "I prefer happiness facilitator," Grace winked. "Besides, look how he smiles around her, like Robert used to smile at you." Margaret touched her pearl necklace, remembering. Love looks good on him. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner again. Tommy brought his new girlfriend. Grace told entertaining stories about the foundation's work, and Clara proudly served her famous apple pie. "Oh," Grace remembered suddenly, Sarah's joining the Foundation's youth committee. Such a caring, young woman. Don't you think so, Jonathan? Jonathan nearly choked on his pie. Yes, that's good for the Foundation. Margaret and Grace exchanged knowing looks. Some things never changed. Mothers would always meddle in their children's love lives. Friends would always tease, and love would always find a way to heal old wounds. Christmas lights twinkled throughout the mansion as Margaret supervised the decorations. After the success of the Morrison merger, there was much to celebrate. The grand staircase gleamed with garlands, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. A little higher on the left, Margaret called to the decorators hanging wreaths. She wanted everything perfect for tonight's holiday party, the first real celebration the mansion had seen in years. Clara rushed in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Thornton, you'll never guess what I just saw in the garden." "What is it?" "Mr. Jonathan and Sarah." He was down on one knee by the rose bushes. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. After 6 months of dating, Jonathan had told her he was planning to propose, but she hadn't expected it so soon. "What did she say?" Margaret asked, though Clara's beaming face told her everything. "She said yes, they're coming in now." Jonathan and Sarah entered hand in hand, both glowing with happiness. Sarah's simple diamond ring caught the light, so different from the flashy one Victoria had demanded. "Mum," Jonathan's voice was thick with emotion, "we wanted you to be the first to know officially." Margaret hugged them both, tears in her eyes. "I couldn't be happier. Welcome to the family, Sarah." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," Sarah said softly. "Oh, please, call me Mom, or Margaret at least." Grace burst through the front door, not even bothering to remove her coat. "Did I miss it? Did she say yes?" "You knew?" Jonathan asked, laughing. "Of course I knew. Who do you think helped your mother keep you two running into each other? At all those charity events?" As word spread, the house filled with well-wishers. Tommy arrived with champagne, and Clara brought out a special cake she'd been saving. Even Mr. Morrison stopped by with his wife. "Next generation of Thorntons," he said proudly, raising his glass. "The company's future is secure." Later, as the party moved to the dining room, Margaret found Jonathan alone in Robert's study. He was looking at his father's portrait above the fireplace. "Do you think Dad would approve?" he asked quietly. "Of Sarah? He'd love her." Margaret smiled. "She has his values: kindness, honesty, hard work. Not like Victoria," Jonathan finished. "You know, when the detective called yesterday about her appeal being denied, I felt nothing. Just peace." "That's healing, sweetheart." Jonathan turned to his mother. "I've been thinking about the company, about the future. I want to create a scholarship program, help underprivileged kids study business ethics. We could name it after Dad. Robert would love that too," Margaret said. Then she grinned. "And I suppose this has nothing to do with Sarah's work with at-risk youth at the Foundation." Jonathan blushed. "She's inspiring. She makes me want to be better, do more, like Dad did. For you." From the dining room, they heard Grace's voice. "Jonathan, Sarah, get in here. Tommy's about to make a toast." As they headed back to the party, Sarah met them at the door. She'd been crying happy tears, her eyes shining with joy. "Everything okay?" Jonathan asked, concerned. "Perfect," Sarah replied. "Grace was just telling me stories about your father, about how he built this company on love and trust. I hope I can help continue that legacy." Margaret watched as her son pulled his fiancée close, kissing her forehead tenderly. Yes, this was real love, not the showy, manipulative, kind Victoria had offered, but something deep and true. The dining room was packed with their extended family, not all related by blood, but bound by something stronger. Grace was teasing Tommy about when he'd proposed to his girlfriend. Clara was showing Sarah her secret recipe book for when you're lady of the house. Even the new security guard was included, singing carols with the housekeeping staff. Looking around at all these smiling faces, Margaret felt Robert's presence strongly. "You'd be so proud," she whispered, touching her pearl necklace. "Our son found his way home." The June morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a wedding. Margaret stood in her old room at the mansion, helping Sarah with her veil. The simple lace dress suited Sarah perfectly, just like the small pearl necklace Margaret had given her, a family heirloom passed down from Robert's mother. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked, adjusting the veil. "A little," Sarah admitted, "but happy nervous, like the day Jonathan first asked me to coffee." Grace burst in, already dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The gardens look magical. Clara's outdone herself with the flowers." Indeed, The garden where Victoria had once planned to destroy their family was now transformed into a wonderland of roses and lilies. White chairs lined the pathway to a flower-covered arch, and soft music drifted through the morning air. "The reporters are behaving themselves," Grace reported. "That piece Sarah wrote for the foundation about second chances really won them over. Such a change from—" She stopped herself. "It's okay," Sarah said softly. "We can talk about Victoria. She's part of this family's story, just not its future." Margaret hugged her soon-to-be daughter-in-law. Sarah had proven herself not just kind and honest, but wise beyond her years. In Robert's old study, Jonathan paced nervously while Tommy adjusted his tie. "The ring?" Jonathan asked for the 10th time. Tommy patted his pocket. "Safe and sound. Now stop pacing before you wear a hole in your father's carpet." The study door opened and Mr. Morrison poked his head in. "Everyone's ready. And Jonathan, the scholarship program's first graduates are here. They wanted to thank you personally." Jonathan smiled. In the year since he'd started the Robert Thornton Ethics in Business Scholarship, dozens of promising students had been given a chance at education they couldn't otherwise afford. It was his father's legacy living on in a new generation. The ceremony itself was everything Margaret had dreamed for her son. As she walked Jonathan down the aisle, his choice, honoring the mother who had stood by him through everything, she saw happy tears in every eye. Clara sniffled from her place of honor in the front row. Grace beamed beside her, while Tommy stood proudly as best man. When Sarah appeared, escorted by her father, Jonathan's face lit up with the kind of love Margaret remembered seeing in Robert's eyes, the kind that lasted forever. The minister spoke about new beginnings, about love that grows stronger through adversity. Margaret thought about how far they'd all come, from that terrible birthday when she'd been cast out, through the dark days of uncovering Victoria's betrayal, to this moment of pure joy. After the vows and rings were exchanged, after the cheers and rice throwing, the celebration moved to a giant tent set up on the lawn. The scholarship students mixed with business leaders, foundation volunteers danced with company executives, and through it all, Jonathan and Sarah moved hand in hand, their happiness touching everyone around them. "Remember when you thought you'd lost everything?" Grace asked, joining Margaret at her table. "Look what you gained instead." Margaret watched as Jonathan led Sarah onto the dance floor. They moved together, as if they'd been dancing all their lives. "A real love story," Grace sighed happily. "Not the fake kind, the true kind that only gets stronger with time." Clara appeared with champagne. "A toast," she declared, "to the true heart of the Thornton family, Margaret, who never lost faith, who fought for love, who showed us all what real strength looks like." "To Margaret!" everyone cheered. Later, as the sun set and lanterns twinkled in the gardens, Margaret found a quiet moment alone. She touched her pearl necklace, Robert's gift from so long ago, and looked up at the stars appearing in the twilight sky. "We did it, my love," she whispered. "Our family is whole again, different maybe, but stronger than ever." "Mom?" Jonathan's voice called softly. He and Sarah stood in the garden doorway, silhouetted against the party lights. "Everyone's asking for you. We're about to cut the cake." Margaret joined her son and his bride, her heart full of joy. As they walked back to the celebration, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, from betrayal to redemption, from loss to love, from endings to new beginnings. The mansion glowed with warmth and laughter, filled with the kind of happiness that comes from weathering storms together. Family portraits smiled down from the walls, Robert's face beaming proudest of all, while new photos waited to be added. New stories waited to be told. This was what Robert had always said. Life wasn't about the mistakes we make, but about how we fix them. About choosing love over bitterness, forgiveness over revenge, hope over fear. As Margaret watched Jonathan feed Sarah a bite of wedding cake, both of them laughing as frosting smeared everywhere, she knew their story would live on, in the company that now truly served its community, in the foundation that helped dreams come true, in the love between a mother and son that had survived its greatest test, and most of all in the simple truth that had guided them home. Real love, true love, never gives up. The end.